very much to everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're just about to get started. So my name is Arton Giles, and I'm one of the co-secretaries of Labour Against Racism and Fascism, and now you can all see me. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for those of you who have joined us for the last couple of days, where we've had some really interesting panels and sessions and workshops, all exploring challenging state violence at this conference, which we're hosting in partnership with Socialists of Colour. This afternoon, we're really pleased to have Akram Solhab and Suresh Grover with us to present this workshop on strategies for the resistance. And this workshop will firstly look at two issues. Firstly, looking at migrants' rights, and then at racial justice, and then we'll go into breakouts and really delve into how we can work towards a movement that fights for these, and on what the most effective tools and collective principles and strategies for organising in these struggles. So without further ado, I know we've only got an hour. I'll introduce Akram Solhab, who is with us this afternoon. Akram is the Advocacy and Campaigns Officer at Migrants Organise, which is a national platform where refugees and migrants organise for power, dignity and justice. His work focuses on supporting communities to challenge the government's hostile environment policies, in particular the Patients Not Passports campaign in partnership with MedAct and the New Economics Foundation. And so throughout this discussion, we'll be posting some links in the chat box that both Akram and Suresh mentioned, so please do keep an eye on that. And obviously at the end, we'll come back for a discussion. But without further ado, I'll bring in Akram for his presentation.
Hi, Arton. Hi, everyone. Lovely to join you today. I'm sorry I've missed the past couple of days of discussion and debate, but I know all the work that LARAF do is really wonderful, really important, and much needed at this time. And especially today's session, which is around strategies for the resistance, which is a great Star Wars title, but also hopefully will focus our minds a little on what we want to get out of today. Because I think where we're at in this country more generally is a very critical juncture, where the challenges we face as communities, whether in relation to migrant justice or, as Suresh will be speaking about, racial justice, and the two overlap significantly to such a degree that we can't really be talking about them separately, but we're nevertheless doing that maybe to clarify different areas of work, or at least set them out in ways that might be useful for us to comprehend. But nevertheless, we find ourselves at a juncture where we need to really think about how we can challenge these instantiations or examples of state violence in a way that's coherent, and a way that has a chance of success. And we think we have a lot these days of conversation around the nature of the problem and where that emerges from, and what brought that about, and where we are now. We have lots of critiques about sometimes, obviously, the views and the policies of the far right, and as they've gained traction in policies and in public discourse. And I think that's now very evident with what's taking place in terms of the boats landing on the south coast, and the public furore, terror, scaremongering that's taking place over a few hundred migrants arriving into a country of 60+ million people, as though that were the biggest issue taking place in our country, and as though we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, and we weren't in the biggest recession in the country's history, and we weren't about to undergo this seismic change in the life of this country, but the focus and the news headlines are about a few hundred people arriving on the south coast of the country. So really there's a long analysis, and maybe people touched on this over the past few days, about how we got here. But what I want to focus on a little more is how we got here politically, in terms of what are the strategies and approaches that have been adopted to migrant justice work, what the current arrangement is, and what we need to do in order to take things forward. And here, I think it's important for us to think in these terms, because we're no longer talking about us as campaigners being involved in some positive change to, individual policies for some subsection of asylum seekers, but we're talking about what do we need to do to completely change the nature of the discussion and rebuild and recohere a serious migrant justice movement around radical and strong anti-racist values. And what's happened over the past few months around the Black Lives Matter movement is we've seen what happens when a radical discourse like that begins to catch fire. It doesn't stop and say we must now focus specifically on the training police receive towards in their apprehension of people on the streets. Rather, this course went the other way, which is to say that this example of violence which took place in the United States is emblematic of the violence we suffer as communities throughout this country and in a variety of different ways. And it's not possible to change the knee on someone's throat when they're being stopped or being pulled out of their car without discussing the legacies of racism and colonialism and how they feed into the policies that we experience every day. Now, that's just not an ideological position on my part. It's what I would argue is a practical position, because we now have an experience in this country of a very number of years where a good part of the advocacy campaign and to a lesser degree organizing work around migration has taken place within a smaller and smaller set of demands that a smaller and smaller group of NGOs make towards the government. Now, at different periods of time, it may have been possible to win concessions from a government who might want to worsen and make unlivable the lives of asylum seekers and refugees, yet at the same time give concessions here and there to pretend that they had some humane policies. And I'm thinking of the new Labour government, who were not vocal as the current government are in their attacks on asylum seekers and refugees, but they nevertheless worsened and made, for example, it impossible for asylum seekers to work or study while they were waiting for their asylum case to be resolved. So that's to say that we now have an object lesson of 20 plus years of organizing around smaller and smaller subsets of demands to try and win them for one group or another in the asylum process. You have an example recently in detention where there were changes to the rules so that for the first time in a very long time, there's no women being detained in detention centers. And some groups of people were celebrating this as a win. At the same time, many of those now arriving on the South Coast are taken and they're being put into detention instead. Children in cages, as is happening in America, is now happening here in the UK. So what does this tell us? It tells us that we can't be dividing up different kinds of oppression. We can't be dividing up different policies. We can't be celebrating wins for one subsection of people if they mean a loss for another group of people. And part of what we're confronted with is a constant attempt to play different groups off against each other. The good migrant, bad migrant is one well-known formulation of that. But you also have different migrant groups, and you have different different policy areas which target people differently and encourage people to focus their demands on something for themselves which they hope they can win, or with something that affects a group of people which they represent, a small national group, for example, rather than trying to win demands that are for the movement as a whole. And there are structural reasons why that has come into place, and there's things that we need to do to structurally overturn that. And there's a piece which a colleague, Neha, and I wrote, which someone may share in the chat, which seeks to chart some of the reasons why we got where we are. And looking from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s at the different structures that migrant and Black community groups used to mobilize against state racism in police practice, but also against successive immigration bills as they were introduced and as they begin to bear down on people's lives and make their ability to live increasingly impossible, and the beginnings of the deportation and the detention regime, which today is very familiar to all of us. And in that article, we also talk about some of the changes that took place in terms of civil society and some of the pressures that were brought to bear on migrant community groups in order to, what we call in Palestine, at least the NGOization, which has become more and more forced into a situation where you're forced to operate on the basis of, rather than a self-help local community group, more in terms of the NGO model. And this was something that was forced upon people as part of the restructuring that took place under New Labour, the funding that was provided to a lot of these groups in order to de-radicalize and weaken the movement as a whole. So there's nevertheless lots of fantastic work being done on a local level, casework, struggles that are taking place. You've seen actions, protests outside detention centers. The migrant justice movement is a massive plethora of different groups, all organizing and being involved locally and across the country. The question that we have is, what can we do to bring that together? What can we do to strengthen that? And what can we do so that it's not individual groups, individual organizations working locally and on their own, but that we can strengthen a radical approach to challenging and overturning the current immigration system. And one of the discussions that we had at Migrants Organize about some of this was amongst our members, who shared with us that, well, if we begin to talk about migration, we can't just, even though one of our members might be involved in a housing campaign in Halifax around G4S accommodation and the disgraceful lack of care, the rat infestations, the barging in by G4S officers into their accommodation on a regular basis. They're being moved around constantly at very short notice. Although they're fighting that housing campaign, they said to us, and through work that we did in a number of meetings of our members, of 60 of our members, and then 120 of our members, was to begin this discussion about, I know that I'm in Halifax having this fight. I also know that the reason I'm here is because the British Empire was in my home country, and the legacies of colonialism and current imperial policy and economic subjugation and extraction of natural resources and illegal wars and the arming of belligerent and despotic regimes by the British state are all, and the far-right alliances with Turkey, Israel, India and others are all some of the chief causes, and of course the environment, are some of the chief causes of why people are migrating in the first place. And when we start talking about migration and the causes of migration, we take any individual story, we're actually mapping a very intricate relationship between British capitalism and the British state and that person's story, from being an unemployed worker in their country of origin to being to someone coming here, or being a political exile, fleeing a regime funded and supported by the British state, to coming here now as an asylum seeker struggling for housing justice somewhere around the UK. That story is actually a story of colonialism. It's a story of history. It's a story that's much wider than single demands and single issue campaigns. And in the process of the conversations we initiated amongst our members, this conversation began to take hold and say, we need something broader as a set of demands, as a set of principles around which we can start to cohere a movement and articulate what our demands are as communities. And what was created out of this was this charter, which I think someone else will now share in the chat, which Migrant Organize created and has begun to disseminate amongst supporters around the country, many different organizations. And although the charter is essentially a document with a set of demands and a rationale and a background behind it, and it's still under development. But the point is that we have lots of public letters that we do and that we write and we support and we send to the government, and we never hear back from them. The point of this document is slightly different, and there's not a set of demands, it's a set of principles that we as a movement can use to start to understand what we're demanding and also how we're demanding it. As in, what do we need to do amongst ourselves as groups in order to work coherently and work together to overcome it? So one of the suggestions that's been put forward by a number of groups is that we've called, and I can send you the link to that also, for a day of action in October, which will be October the 10th and 11th, weekend of action, whose purpose is, for a first time in a long time, to bring together all the different groups affected by, and the solidarity organizations and trade unions and the labor movement who ought to be interested in struggling alongside us into the conversation about taking action together against the hostile environment in a variety of different ways, making visible the lives of the people who were killed and have been killed and continue to have their lives destroyed by the hostile environment, to make that visible. Not a story which comes and goes with the Windrush scandal, but hundreds of thousands of other people lived through it and ignored and marginalized and silenced on a daily basis. But how can we make this a vibrant movement which connects across communities, which builds solidarity, which understands the connection of this policy around migration to the state racism of the British state and the needs of British capital and how that's fluctuated accordingly, and how the movement for socialism in Britain has been undermined by an attempt to scapegoat migrants, and how some sections of the left have gone along with that, thinking that it might be possible to build a narrow socialism in Britain without thinking internationally, without thinking of migrant community here as their comrades and as their comrades in the struggle for social justice. And I think that the discussion around migration, there's been a lot of it recently, touches on all of these points which are central to the struggle for socialism. So I have two questions which I hopefully will explore in my, we'll be exploring in the session that I and others will be hosting, which is around what can we do as a first step if we think we understand what we need to build a migrant justice movement. What are the first steps we can take towards building that in terms of getting on the same page? What are the common principles? How do we articulate them? How do we include them and integrate them into the organizing and campaigning work that we do? How do we make visible the voices of the communities affected? How do we support those affected by individual campaigns? How do we reach out to allies, trade unionists, socialists, other progressives in this country, that we bring them on board on the basis of a understanding of history and colonialism and oppression, and rather than merely trying to have one or two stories, sub-stories that we say about, and just the title of Refugees Welcome. So these are some of the questions that I'll be looking at. I don't know how long I've taken up, but maybe I'll stop there. And I'm really excited to have this discussion because it's one that we really ought to all be involved in. And I think the key point for us to all begin to think about is that this is our responsibility too. And it's our responsibility to think and engage in this big question about how we build a movement that can be serious about winning on these issues, because as we've seen, people's lives are urgently depending on it. And then it's a daily struggle across this country which has been made completely invisible and people have been silenced. So how can we as socialists stand up and stand with and work with and build this movement? I'm really excited to be having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akram. Thank you for that. That was there was a lot in there, and yeah, there was a lot there to definitely start thinking about. And I think what you're saying about imagining the bigger picture is so true. So we'll definitely unpack more of that in the breakout groups that we'll go into after we hear from our next speaker. And just quickly, I did forget to say at the beginning, please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and say where you're from and include your pronouns, please. And you can access that if you're on a laptop. You can see the chat box already. It should be there, just bottom panel. And if you're on a phone, you can just click on your screen and tap the 3 buttons that say more, and then there'll be the chat function there. And as I said, we'll be using that. Obviously, some links have been posted. We'll be sending out a document with all the links as well afterwards. But anyway, not to take up any more time, I'll introduce Suresh Grover. So Suresh Grover is the founder of the monitoring group and has led campaigns to help the families of Stephen Lawrence, Zahid Mubarak and Victoria Klimby. Through over 40 years of tireless campaigning, Suresh has worked against popular racism, racial attacks and media issues, as well as state racism and institutional racism. And we're really, really grateful to have him with us this afternoon. So over to you, Suresh.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Really, really excited about being part of this discussion. And I agree with everything that Akram has commented on and said and put forward. I just want to look at it from a slightly different angle, which is connected and obviously aligned with migrant justice. But I want to really focus on the priorities and the challenges that we face today, but learning from history if we can. But a few introductory comments about the nature of work that we do. As you've said, we were established 40 years ago. Next year is our anniversary. We were baptized into political and kind of social activity by the explosive and murderous intent of racism and its discriminatory impact. You know, most of my generation have been victims of racial violence or racial abuse or discrimination. I was stabbed by skinheads when I was very young, and that propelled me to activity. And you know, fast forwarding forward, I have to admit, right from the outset, the network that the monitoring group works with, the so-called hate crime network, whatever that means, is strong on advocacy, but very, very weak politically. And partially that is due to the fact that some of the groups want to replicate an NGO kind of model that ties them to state for information, research, and sometimes access to the media. And what we've seen really in the last decade is that the specific hate crime policies that have been developed have really shifted their ground and now begin to focus on individualized definitions of racism and identity politics. The IHRA definition on anti-Semitism is a classic example of this, which the debate there's absolutely necessary to have that debate, but I think we need to look at the fact that it's contributed to a dismantling of a collective understanding of racism, both in the UK, across Europe and internationally, and a dismantling of a unified struggle against all forms of racism in favor of a very misconstrued misrepresentation of victim-centered approaches. And it's ironic that has happened because the monitoring group is one of the few campaigning groups that actually developed the notion of victim-centered and community-centered approaches from 1980-81 onwards, even before the Lawrence case. And the impact of this has led to a hard understanding of racism. It's now, if you look at the discussions in Parliament and the media, devoid of any political, social, or economic context, and priorities kind of afforded to online comments, personal insults, everything can be racist, whatever you say, and priorities really over the structural and institutional forms of racism and lived experience. And it's only because of the BLM marches more recently in the United States in particular that systemic and structural forms of racism has reasserted itself on the agenda, despite the efforts that many of the community groups and defense campaigns have been trying to raise over the last 2-3 decades in this country. And there's a real tragedy in this because despite the fact that if you look at the hate crime figures, over 80% of the victims of hate crimes are actually brown, black, and migrant people. In this context of the misconstrued definition, the agenda is actually not set by them. It's set by state agencies, and we've been marginalized, and our experiences have been undermined, and actually, as people, we've been invisibilized in this narrative that has taken place, despite the fact, and this is really important, that we as Black, brown, migrant people were unified politically black in the 1970s and 80s, and there's a wealth of fantastic struggles that were waged over people's deaths and living conditions, And we won most of them. And the policies that were derived from on hate crimes actually were derived because of the struggles against racism. But there seems to be a total flipping off of this process. And I want to start right from the start in terms of our understanding our collective principles in this way. When we look at the struggles against racism, changing public attitudes to racial difference isn't actually the first place to start. We have to go to the very foundations, which is the British state itself. In UK, people encounter extreme forms of violence, not only at the hands of racist thugs on the street or far right or the EDL, but actually by people employed by the state or state employees. This is how it is. Racism is given birth by the British state and fostered within the wider UK society. And when we look at the significance of the report of the Macpherson inquiry or the Stephen Lawrence's death, published in 1999, and its straightforward declaration that one particular state institution, the Metropolitan Police, was racist, or more accurately, institutionally racist, people knew this anyway, but hearing the authorities concede this point was actually significant. But what was remarkable for me as the coordinator of the Stephen Lawrence family campaign was how many politicians and media editors created a news storm expressing shock at this revelation. Even then, the Labour Home Secretary, Jack Straw, delivered the news as if it was a new discovery, as that institutional racism existed. And one of my friends, James Kelman, he's a great Scottish linguistic writer, in a recent article put it like this, and I just quote him. He says, these are the situations wherein elected politicians discover the true nature of authority, of temporary versus permanent, the reality of the place in the scheme of things of the House of Commons in respect of the state. Apparently, Straw was furious when he discovered the truth some 15 years after ordering the inquiry. It is difficult to imagine a parliamentary of his experience and caliber being found guilty of such naivety. Chomsky has made this point many, many times over decades ago. And he says that these people are not telling lies. In fact, what's happening is they're so far gone that they believe what they say. And information of this kind is rarely discussed in public forums, especially forums to do with racism. But I think that's essential. Through it, we gain the insight into why we must distinguish between working of the Whitehall government, which is temporary, and the British state, which is permanent. It is, if a permanent state institution empowers the act of violence and murder, it is hard to predict that they might withhold evidence from the work of a temporary administration. Any form of external meddling in state affairs is unacceptable, and government meddling is in external meddling is whether it's from so-called a right-left or right-wing or so-called left-wing parties, it actually makes very little difference. For that system, stability is actually what it counts, and the survival of the system is seen as paramount. And in today's settings, you'd think the prevalence of state or institutional racism wouldn't even be contested, and that anti-racist forces would be building alliances to dismantle the very structures that reinforce it. But actually, the reverse is true. Now, at this moment, over the last COVID period, there's a new conscious plan by the establishment to dismantle the narrative around institutional and state structural racism rather than challenge the problem itself. Just let's look at a number of examples glaring examples and their significance. Let's look at the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, who in her parliamentary evidence only a couple of months ago gave a 9-hour testimony. And in it, she says that not only is it unhelpful to introduce the term institutional racism, but actually she believes that the war against racism in the Metropolitan Police has been won. She's in denial about the prevalence of racism in her force, even when there is what we would call a mountain of evidence in plain sight. Just look at the figures since the beginning of the lockdown. If you look at the Metropolitan Police's own statistics, there's a 59% increase in the amount of stop and searches conducted on young black men in London compared to the same period last year, resulting in a staggering 25,000 searches during the current pandemic when we are supposed to be indoors. It means that 30% of all young males, black males in London, aged 18 to 24 in London were stopped and searched. This is an unprecedented number in any form of policing. Even more worrying is the fact that during the lockdown, when crime rates fell, stop and searches actually continued and were unjustifiable even by police's own rationale. So from March 20 to May 20, the Met conducted a massive 21,940 searches. 80% of the searches led to no action. In May 20 itself, just in the month, 1 in 8 young black males in London were stopped and searched and suffered that indignity simply because of the color of their skin. This is what an elite athlete, a member of the team GB Athletics, Bianca Williams said. She said, you have to be careful because being black is a crime. It's not somebody who's radical, it's not somebody who's an activist. She's just purely focused on her sports presence and excellence. And she and her partner, who's also an athlete, were not just stopped and searched, they were stopped, handcuffed, and searched while their baby was in the car. There's an unlawful use of handcuffs before searches, and this has become standardized, coupled with an increase in excessive use of dangerous tasers, where black people are generally 4 times more likely to be targeted than a white person. During pandemic, they were 8 times more likely than white people. And this is a toxic reality of black community in London, which is the most diverse community in the country. And we have a mayor who's a Labour mayor. And it actually gets worse. Only 2 years ago, in 2018, the Information Commissioner found, and I quote, serious breaches of data protection, privacy and equality legislation with the potential to cause damage and distrust to a disproportionate number of young black men in the so-called gangs matrix. Amnesty International has described the matrix as a racially discriminatory system that stigmatizes young black men for the music they listen to and their behavior on social media. It warned, and I quote, some police officers have been acting like they're in the Wild West, making the false assumption that they can set up fake profiles and covertly defriend people online to monitor them without using legislation. And this is what Amnesty said, the Mayor of London needs to dismantle the matrix unless it can bring it in line with international human rights standards. Weeks ago, one of London's black members of parliament, Dawn Butler, was stopped and searched, and she called for systemic change. Despite all and more evidence, the Metropolitan Commissioner has the audacity to mark the 25th anniversary of the McPherson report, saying that there's no problem with institutional racism. there's a reluctance to accept this problem, so they don't see it. And rather than waging a war against racism, which is what she claims, the Metropolitan Police have conducted a vitriolic racist campaign against the Black community in London. And only July 2020, in an editorial on 10th of July, this is what the Guardian editorial said. It actually pleaded for the commissioner to police the police and not to terrorize the Black community, and concluded that the London police force was poorly managed, poorly disciplined, and inefficiently accountable to the public itself. Where is the anti-racist movement on that? And if you just look at the pandemic, I don't have time to go it, but we know that there is a dismissal of structural racism and how it contributed to the disproportionality in deaths of BME communities and the grave illness that they suffered disproportionately. I just want to raise another thing before I touch on COVID and its impact, because I don't think I have enough time. I just want to look at how the government is responding and what we should be doing about it. So you have the pandemic, you look at the disproportionality, and it's obvious there's a prima facie case showing the disproportionality. And it's against this background that in June 2020, because of the pressure and the outrage by people, Boris Johnson is forced to concede or repair the damage, and he argues for and sets up the so-called Commission for Racial Disparity and Racial and Ethnic Disparities, called CRED. And who leads it? Munira Mirza, who's in record of denying notions of institutional racism and its existence. Who's going to chair it? Somebody called Tony Sewell. And Tony Sewell's appointment raises serious public concerns and links to the strategy that the government is adopting to dismantle the very foundations of the struggles that we've won over a period of time. Only a couple of months ago, when the BLM movements were marching in London and New York, his views raised serious concerns for activists in the Black communities. In an interview published in The Guardian, he asked Black young people to stop navel-gazing identity politics and that won't help Black people. In a talk radio in June, he was critical of the protests, dismissive of concerns of institutional racism in policing. And this is what he says. He said, this thing is becoming completely irrational. In other words, people saying racism is the cause. And he says that there's a bandwagon mentality and people jumping on it, which shows a dismissal of the lived experience of Black, brown, and migrant people over decades and decades, and even during the pandemic. The point I'm making is a simple one, that when we, as anti-racist activists, look at racism, we should be very focused on where our challenges are going to be. And that challenge has to be, first of all, on the focus of state institutions. It's simply not good enough to be outraged by the excesses of far-right violence at times, and we should be outraged by them, but not deal with racism that flows from the government and its institutions. And when we look at state racism, we have to look at it in the context of how these state institutions and its policies have evolved. And Black and brown and migrant people know, not just instinctively, but from records, that the incarceration of Black and brown people in penal institutions in this country is actually linked historically to the manner in which penal institutions existed and were developed in colonial periods in India, in Africa, in Latin America, and currently exist in Palestine. And the second point I want to make is that instead of having defensive campaigns or apologetic campaigns around our history and colonialism, we should become more offensive. There should be a political defense of people who took part in the demolition of statues that were destroyed in Bristol, and there's debates on other stuff, and they should be seen as political campaigns rather than as so-called criminal manifestations. And in terms of our history, we should also be very, very offensive about what the curriculum in the universities and in colleges should reflect. And in order to do that, we just can't rely on the government and institutions to develop and foster that program. It has to be done in a living way, active, where students themselves are involved in universities as well as colleges, as well as in schools, to develop that program. And when we look at colonialism, we just cannot look at it in the past in the way that others have reminded us for many years, including people like Akram. Palestine is a manifestation of living colonialism in this time, not just in terms of the massive gross atrocities that exist under human rights violation, but the manner in which the British and the American keep on supporting a regime that is totally oppressive, colonial in its outlook, and racist in some of its manifestations. And we need to really make Palestine as a key campaign, embody it, embed it in our anti-racist campaigns. And the last point I want to make is that we need to put and challenge the far right in a way that we can defeat it, and not just go from one demonstration to the other. I'm not saying those are not important, absolutely critical to challenge them all the time. We know from history that we have to challenge them. But we need to situate the growth of the far right within the context of the growth of the far right authoritarianism that exists not just in Europe, but on a global basis, linking Trump with fascism in Europe and people like Modi and Erdogan in other parts of the country, because they are socially conservative and the manifestations of their politics are against poor minorities, excessive draconian violence and stripping of citizens of people, even when they have the right to live in that country. Our localized struggles have to become international. So the two questions that I would pose for the workshops are, there are two forms of racism, really, principally one that kills and the other one that discriminates. How does it become relevant, and when it is relevant for us to be focusing one or the other? And if we are going to combine the two, what are the strategies we adopt? And the second is that if we are really serious about building alliances, and we are, there's no question, otherwise we wouldn't be in this seminar and part of an organization, we need to be as clear and as robust about its strategies as the coalition building exercise that prevails in the process of creating an organization. What are the elements that are required, which are relevant, which are very critical for us to connect university students with working class communities, migrants with people who are Black and brown who've been in this country? How we make sure that when we talk about working class, we don't dismiss the Black within that working class, and in history that goes back even to the Chartist movement. And we don't individualize the contributions made by Black and migrant communities in the country. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Suresh. As always, there was so much in there and so much interesting stuff to take away. And we will try and move into breakouts now. I know we're running a bit short on time, but we're going to hopefully spend about just under 10 minutes in these two breakouts discussing those two questions from Akram and those two questions from Suresh. So I'll split everyone into the rooms, and the questions will be posted in the chat, repeated and then hopefully we can come back together and do a quick feedback and hear some closing comments from our speakers. So we're going to go into the two rooms, and room one will be on Akram's questions around on the fight for migrant justice, and the second room will be with Suresh on racial justice. And we are ready. So you'll get an invitation to join. And obviously, just quickly, as always, if you're someone who contributes a lot to meetings, please be aware of that. And you're someone who's usually a bit more shy, then we encourage you to contribute, especially if it's your first time contributing. So please do bear that in mind. And thank you very much. Please click join, and we'll meet back here just after 2:30 to hear a bit of feedback. Hi everyone, thank you for that. Thanks for coming back. We'll just wait a few more seconds for everyone to join us. I'm aware we're running over our time, so we will just sum up quite quickly if we can. Hopefully there'll be someone from each group who's happy to do quite a brief feedback in terms of what we spoke about, addressing those two questions. And I know that some notes have been written up about what was discussed in the groups. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of consolidate and share that out possibly after the session. But can someone from Akram's group, breakout group one, feedback?
Yeah, we were kind of we didn't really have time to get into it, but we were just getting into it and then we were cut off. But yeah, we had a question about the charter. We had a question which Andrew was saying about how do we get different groups to work together, and we think that was the first step, getting people to work together, different groups. We had a discussion about the media discourse and how we can overcome that. And we had the beginnings of one contribution from Lauren about the role of the Labour Party and as a socialist, but then that was all we had time for, unfortunately. But I feel like we could have, had we had more time, said a lot more.
Yeah, no, apologies. It's was the perennial question of time, but yeah,
I mean, Laura, not Lauren. I misspoke. Sorry.
Yeah, hopefully, I mean, we do hope to do more of this, and it's a kind of ongoing process. And so thank you for your presentation and for those discussions. Can I ask Suresh to kind of come back and give his thoughts on what was spoken about in that group, and perhaps some final closing comments, because we do need to wrap up quite soon, if that's all right with you, Coulson.
Yeah, Suresh or Mohammed, I think took some notes, unless anyone else.
I'm happy to quickly go through the notes, and I'd love Suresh to come back on them and tell us what he thought about when we discussed. So on question one, we talked about the two different forms of racism and what strategies we need to adopt to bring them together. And I think we spoke about how it's difficult to draw the line between those two different forms of racism, and we think about healthcare and the omission of institutional racism and how that impacts the groups that we talk about when they have high chances of heart disease and things like that. And we spoke about how discrimination and the racism that kills is actually part of a progressive timeline, if you like, or a progressing process, and we need to draw that out and embed that into our activism, or into what we're trying to address. And then on question two, we talked about what the critical steps are to building alliances between groups, and we spoke about how there's important contributions in how sort of liberal identity politics has sort of created a blur here, and has intervened effectively in solidarity, and we need to have that political education. And a part of that was sort of discussing the multicultural movement. And we also spoke about how a bit about how Amrit Wilson yesterday spoke about existing left infrastructures engaging with communities, understanding where workers are coming from, and that way we incorporate those struggles and those institutional forms of oppression into sort of the wider movement. but yeah, that was a quick run through of everything we spoke about. We also talked about like the need for forums, for example, locally to bridge the differences that we see between each other. But yeah, Suresh, do please come in on what you thought about that. Suresh didn't speak much in the breakout room, so I'm interested to hear that.
Yeah, so Suresh, if I can ask you to make just a couple of brief, very brief closing comments, and then we'll have to end it there. But thank you very much, obviously, to both Akram and all your time.
Yeah, really two quick points. I mean, the reason why I posed the first point being racism that kills and racism that discriminates is really to do with the nature of the state, how we understand it, and whether we can reform it or we need to have a structural change. I can't discuss that. I mean, I can't go into the detail now, but it raises the very nature of the state and an anti-racist movement's relationship to it. And the second reason is obvious why people are raising the whole issue of coalition, because of the atomization within our own movement and growth of new forms of political narratives and frameworks, which are either based on identity politics, but also on non-secular values, or do not align with our policies to do with race, class, or gender, which are, in my view, we should be uncompromising in terms of the values we have. And I think the key to both the question is really where we want to end up. We always know what we're against, but if you don't work out actually what we want in place of it, it actually will mean that our desired campaigns are going to be not have the full benefit of the victories that they deserve. So we need to be really sharp over the next couple of years because of the growth of, because there's going to be unemployment, there's going to be the backdrop of COVID and all the implications of inequality and more poverty. We need to be clear how anti-racism fits into the whole policies to do with what kind of society we want to live in. That's why I posed those questions,
Well, yeah, thank you very much for that, Suresh. Those are some really profound final comments. And I think both, yeah, kind of when we're speaking about this and this session, it's kind of sometimes overwhelming about looking at, the challenges that we face and what we have to do. And I think both yourself and Akram are really helpful in trying to kind of, whilst maintaining that big picture and fighting for for the world, really chipping down at how we can do it in the minutiae and how we can build those coalitions, how we can organize, and looking at what's happened in the past. So thank you very much to both Akram Solhab and Suresh Grover. I do apologize that we had to cut those breakouts a bit short, but we are running out of time. But thank you for all those contributions. The session has been really interesting. I think we've got lots to take away and think about. If you found the discussions interesting and want to help us continue to organise around these issues, please join Labour Against Racism and Fascism on Slack to organise and discuss developing our campaigns and events. We'll post the sign up link for that in the chat now. As well as if you've got any feedback about the conference for us, we'd love to hear from you. So please do fill in a feedback form, which we will post in the chat now. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for the final session of the conference, which will be getting underway at 3:30 p.m. So in about 45 minutes time. And that's looking at Black Lives Matter, building and reflecting on the movement. And here we'll hear from speakers from America, London and Coventry about how we as socialists can support the BLM movement at a national level and also in our communities. And the link to that workshop to register will be posted in the chat now. So I really hope you can join us for that final one. And I hope that you've enjoyed today's session this afternoon, as well as any of the other sessions you've attended. Once again, a huge thank you to our speakers, Akram Solhab and Suresh Grover. And thank you very much to our facilitators for those groups and to the volunteers, and thank you for tuning in. I'll leave the call running for a couple of minutes so you can grab any links you need from the chat, and we'll also be sending out an email with all the links mentioned by both Akram and Suresh in the next couple of days, so keep an eye for that, and I'll say goodbye and solidarity.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.